first speaker is Bill Uttal from Arizona State University, and before that at the University of Michigan. I think he will set the right tone, the tone that I would hope for with this title, The Skeptic's Tale. Do you have your speak? Yeah.
Yes, I'm all set.
Okay, speakers.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to the University of California at Irvine and your center for inviting me. The original title of my talk was The Curmudgeon's Tale, but a friend of mine told me that's really something I should let other people refer to me as. So I changed the title to something a little bit more a little bit softer. Now let's see if I can make this work. No? There. First of all, I would like to give you my conclusions. I promise not to leave immediately after I've done this, but I do want you to know where I'm going. One general point, and most of my points are going to be very general, unlike the statistical experts who are making up the main portion of this meeting. But I want to argue that brain imaging is the wrong level of analysis to answer the mind-brain question. And I'll make it clear in a while why I believe that is the case and why it is so limited. Second of all, I want to present to you a lot of empirical data from other people's laboratories that make the point that the data that we're getting is very inconsistent, very irregular, and generally unreplicated. And to do that, I will have to lean upon meta-studies of one kind or another. And the third thing I would like to leave you with is, given these preliminary issues, what is it that, how is it that we should think about the organization of the brain at the present time? And my argument is that we have to expunge the residual impact of phrenology, of localized parts of the brain representing modular cognitive processes. How am I going to get to these conclusions? I'm going to do it by a little bit of philosophical background. I will then talk about some of the psychological problems in the field of imaging. I will probably repeatedly get back to the localization and modularization issues because that really is an important theme that runs through so much of this work. There are some conceptual issues which I will discuss, some statistical issues which I shall mention, but at fear of the expertise in my colleagues in this meeting, I probably won't go into in great detail. And I want to also make it clear why I think the imaging field is beset by so many reliability issues, and then finally present this new metaphor to you. The foundations. First of all, what is it we're really trying to do? I think that sometimes in the excitement of imaging and all the beautiful pictures and so on, we forget that deep down underneath, there are certain philosophical postulates that are fundamental to what we're doing. One of them is that mind is a natural product of physical chemical processes. All the criticisms I'm making do not in any way speak to the issue of a dualistic theory or anything other than this real physical materialism. And then the specific question that cognitive science is pursuing is, how does the brain make the mind? That is what we've been looking forward to. I'm sure other people will say that we're doing other things now, but deep down at the most fundamental level, that's what I believe we're doing. And the basic answer, unproven, unsupported by any empirical data, but seemingly the most plausible argument, is that it is the vast network and interconnections of all of the neurons in our brain that make up this grand and glorious thing we call awareness or consciousness, or any of the other words that have been used over the thousands of years, really. And the basic problem, if given this foundation, is that the neurons in our brains are A, so numerous, and B, so complexly interconnected that for all practical purposes, we can't operate at that level. When I said before that we accepted what I think is generally the Hebbian notion of networks of neurons connected by variable synapses and great complexity in them, we set ourselves up for what is, for all practical purposes, a intractable problem, computational problem. Okay, so if we can't do it at the neural network level, how do we have to do it? Well, we do it by leaning on not the micro details of the neural net, but rather macroscopic measures of what's going on in the nervous system. And we use things like EEGs and evoked brain potentials, or event-related potentials, I'm told repeatedly is what people nowadays are using. We use PET, and most of all, because of all of its advantages, we use fMRI. But all of these methods have a major problem with them. They all finesse the basic problem by pooling information from the neural networks. And I'm sure that all of you would agree that when you pool data, information gets lost. It's something that is just a basic fact. Central tendency does not give you the same amount of information as the details of each individual component in a system and what they're doing. I have been accused from time to time of being not a fan of brain imaging, and particularly of fMRI. I must tell you right off the bat, I think this is the most important medical and biological tool that's been invented since anesthesia or sliced white bread even. It is really tremendously important. We can predict strokes. We can look at the distribution of transmitter substances. We can look at the degree of myelination of a nerve. We can study the interconnecting tracks and pathways between different regions of the brain using diffusion tensor imaging. We can study the effects of drugs. We can locate brain tumors. And for some of us, it becomes increasingly important, we can study things like Alzheimer's disease and other aging effects on the brain. This is clearly the most powerful and anatomical and physiological tool that has ever been available to us, and people have gravitated to it for the best of the possible reasons. However, brain imaging has many issues, and it's specific to those in which we are trying to connect brain images and cognitive processes or mental activity. In those situations, there are problems, and those are the things that I'm going to emphasize in my talk, not the good parts of it. First of all, just as a general background, I hope all of you are aware of the papers by Weisberg and McCabe and Castell. They did experiments in which they asked evaluators of scientific articles to rate these on some quality scale. And what they found throughout and consistently was that the pictures that were, when you added pictures to these papers, they were accepted much stronger, much more positively and rated higher than when there were no pictures there, even though everything else was identical. Roskies has called this the illusion of inferential proximity. Another sort of social issue that occurs repeatedly in this is the iconic experiment. An experiment is done and it leads to a succession of continuing and logically connected experimental designs. One of the most interesting, of course, was H.M., who just recently died. How many of you know who H.M. was? He was the fellow who had surgery done, experimental surgery done on him because of a uncontrolled epilepsy. And the surgeon who did it wrote a classic paper with Milner about the effects of HM. Well, I went back and read the original paper recently, and there's a very surprising thing about it. HM, this was not a case history of HM, it was a case history of 10 other people, 3 of whom had comparable severe short-term memory effects, as did HM. 5 of them had a constellation of either moderate or idiosyncratic things that didn't seem to fit that mode, and 2 of them had no connection at all with the established between the hippocampus and short-term memory. Now, this led to an enormous sequence of research, enormous program of research that followed up on the idea that the hippocampus was the thing. It may or may not be, and certainly the research in the last few years has been very complicated, but it is the iconic experiment that is described in the Scoville and Milner paper was not enough to have justified that research. And then there's the power of the zeitgeist. A zeitgeist is established by one of these iconic experiments, and it establishes a kind of a metaphor for the brain. But the metaphor that Scoville and Miller were proposing was the idea that the hippocampus was a region of the brain that was specifically located in a particular part of the brain and was specifically associated with a particular module of cognitive processing. Now, I'm shifting gears a little bit now. So, there are other psychological issues in this field, and they're not at all problems of the technology, really. The technology is superb, but many, many experiments in this field are confounded or contaminated, really, by a lack of ability to define exactly what the psychological processes are. Psychology, in general, informs neurophysiology rather than the other way around. But the big problem is that we have a difficulty in classifying or describing or defining psychological processes. What is short-term memory? What is perception? What is perception? A whole host of different words that we use all the time that are really constructs that may or may not represent something that is comparable to the biological functions that are there. And as a result, we don't have good independent variable control. We have a lot of uncertainty about what the data means because the input to the experiment was inadequate. One of my favorite things is if you're told to think about something or not think about something, there's the problem of paradoxical, or what Wegner calls ironic responses. Don't think about a cow. You're going to be thinking about a cow for as long as you possibly can. We tend to oversimplify in this context of psychology. I hope this is clear. Oh, good. It's better on yours, my screen here. But this is kind of a simple and simplistic view of what cognitive processes are like. We have names for attention and short-term memory and decision-making and so on. But that can't be what it's really like. This is probably what it's more likely to be. This is something from Norman and Rummelhart's 1975 book that I really enjoyed tremendously because it gives you an idea of the cognitive processing that is involved in something. I think the question asked was, what ingredients do you need to make a cake, and what dishes would you get dirty? And the complexity of psychological reality is grossly underestimated by this. And then there are localization and modularization issues that I spoke about a bit before, and as I said, I'd be returning to them. The current metaphor for the brain, and this is a little bit out of date, I admit it, but the general metaphor is that there are places in the brain that have specific cognitive functions. And these specialized locales have been developed to, have evolved, is the word I'm looking for, to perform a particular function. And the cognitive modules, which are really products of that confusion that I spoke about a moment ago at the psychological domain, feed it back and forth into this. This, of course, is the philosophical overtones underlying the old phrenological ideas. Excuse me. Gall and Spurzheim's work was ridiculous, and it didn't take long for a number of very bright guys to show that it was incorrect. But they were also, in some way, the father of this basic idea that the brain had specific locales, and that has continued, and it's percolated down through all is always a strong word, but it's percolated down through much of modern psychology and much of modern neuromeasurements like the fMRI. We used to have pictures like this. I just pulled this out of a journal someplace. I think it's a PET scan, and this is before maybe 1988 or so. I beg your pardon, 1998. Let's say the turn of the century. This is the kind of data that was being presented. A picture was presented, a stimulus was presented, and a brain image was taken, and people would look for the spot that was to be associated with the brain. But this is what's happening nowadays. You may not be able to read this, but this is a typical set of responses from a kind of ordinary experiment. What it was, it had something to do with the theory of mind, which I don't even know the details about. But what people are finding now and reporting more and more often is that every part of the brain seems to be responding to a certain degree. The amygdala, the cerebellum, cingulate gyrus, frontal gyrus, parietal, temporal, the whole works is being here. And this should put to rest the idea of narrow localization. So we really have known for years, I think it's been well appreciated for years, that there is no known localized representation of cognitive modules. And there's universal agreement today, I think, that distribution is the way the brain is organized. Again, this is nothing particularly new. We've had brain circuits proposed to explain different kinds of cognitive processes for years and years. The Papez circuit, the Kaz's auditory system, the attention system, procedural learning system, and so on and so on. Okay, so I hope that confirms what most of you probably already agree with, is that precise localization of specific cognitive processes is not the way the system is operating. So there's some other problems. One of them is what we might call the one-to-many or the underdetermination problem. And that is that when we get any kind of a macro measure of what's going on in the brain, it is underdetermined. And that is, there are literally an innumerable number of alternative explanations of that. And the fact that a brain image is associated or correlated with some stimulus does not mean that it can explain it. The result of this underdetermination is behavioral and mathematical neutrality. And by that I mean, and I think I'd include this also with the, include in this, with behavioral and mathematical neutrality, I'd also include brain images. And what I'm saying there is that it is impossible to go from any one of these things, a behavior, a mathematical model, or a brain image, to the specific system, the specific neurological instantiation that is responsible for producing that behavior, producing that brain image, or stimulating us to think about a particular explanation. What these are all good for is describing what's going on, but not explaining. Then there's another issue, conceptual, that I have designated as a conceptual issue, and that's the sign code distinction. And I've been preaching this little tale for years and years, and nobody seems to catch up on it. But it's entirely possible that you can find brain activity that is highly correlated with a stimulus that may have nothing at all to do with the instantiation or the particular mechanisms that work in the nervous system. Things can be correlated and maybe even well correlated and still be not part of those neural mechanisms in which the neural activity becomes or is the psychoneural equivalent of the cognitive process. So that's another, and then finally, there's this indirectness of measurement. And everybody knows well that going from a thought to the blood oxygen level is a series of steps, of inferential steps. Well, one of the terrible things would be if you could show that the blood oxygen level was not correlated with the neural or activity itself. And at least there are beginning to be some papers that are making this same point. One of them is Sirotin and Dawes. I get a lot of stuff sent to me that most of you may never have heard about, but there it is, a disassociation of the neural and bold responses. And then, of course, there's the problem of the arbitrary threshold. What you would call, and what led a lot of people back in pre-2000 to zero in on a particular spot was the arbitrariness of the threshold. If you put your threshold at this point, you're missing all the other peaks of activity here. But there's another problem that's even more important that has to do with no differential activity. And this has to do with the well-known limitations of the subtraction method. Subtraction scores are indeterminate. If, in mathematical terms, if you subtract the control from the experimental data, you do not get a meaningful value that really tells you anything. And this is basic to all of the work, no matter how elaborate the statistical bases are. It's very important to establish a difference, and this difference is indeterminate. And the problem is that no change in the image, well, in that previous slide, no change in the image down here, that no differential activity may represent an enormous amount of change and difference in the neural network, the level at which things are really important. So a change, on the other hand, may not actually solve the problem, because if you dote only on changes, because changes may reflect inconsequential or irrelevant sign activity rather than code activity. And now, here's where I feel humble, and I really am going to leave this all to my colleagues to go into greater depth about, but there are a lot of statistical problems. There are some that have been known for a long time, the file drawer problem. One of the file drawer problems, the basic one, is the idea that if you have 20 studies and 19 of them find no effect and 5 of them find some effect, 5% of them find some effect, you tend to throw away all of the low statistical significance studies. And that is, there's a modern manifestation of that. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to get a paper published, an article in a journal that is really terribly disparate from the present zeitgeist. And that also adds to this problem of a misrepresentation of the effects. We also have, as Vol and most notoriously recently, Vol has pointed out, overblown correlations because of a lack of appreciation of some very basic statistical ideas that the degree of correlation is has to be modified by the degree of reliability of the two things you're trying to correlate. And the double dipping problem, also a brand new point. Kriesgart and his colleagues pointed out that selecting a group of voxels to use in your subsequent analysis is a violation of statistics and good sense, I would say. We also have the problem of low statistical power. It is very common nowadays to use a very small number of subjects in an experiment. But most of all, it's reliability, as it is evidenced in the empirical databases. There is variability between people. There is variability in the regions of the brain that are associated with a particular cognitive processes. There is variability and non-replicability of many, many studies that purport to be doing the same thing. And this is really the main thrust of my entire paper here. There's a fellow by the name of Miller, who has been publishing on individual differences for some years. This is one sample of data from his experiment. There are 9 subjects here, and each one of them has with certain activations when this is episodic memory retrieval in this experiment. And if you look at the data from each individual, you can see that they vary substantially in the part of the brain that is attributed to be associated with this particular memory task. If you take all the data and put them together with a good statistical test, they will look like this. The data from the 9 individuals pool to give you what appears to be a good answer. But if you look back on it, it's an extremely noisy sort of thing. And now here also are some meta-studies. This particular one has to do with the Stroop experiment. It was from a paper by Newman and others. And in this particular experiment, people were doing a experiment, a very well-defined experiment. And he studied 239 activations were from a dozen or more. I've forgotten the exact number of experiments, but these were, each one of these little colored dots is an activation peak from a very, very large number of experiments, a dozen or 20 or something in that range. And as you can see, this glass brain presentation of this puts activations all over the whole brain. This is a clear example of distribution, as is this. This is a similar study by Laird and Company, 2005, and also giving this a somewhat more complicated, but still a glass brain image. You see that the responses are scattered all over the brain. This happens to be for a Stroop test also, and if you carefully analyze these two slides I just shown you, you find that there isn't much agreement even between these two meta-studies. Okay, here's another one. This is 11 PET studies of single word reading. And again, there is a very wide distribution. It's not over the whole brain, but it gives you an idea also. It makes the point, I hope, that the stimuli, or the activations rather, are distributed over the whole brain, same psychological process, who knows what causes it. And here's a little study I did personally. I did a meta-study of 16 studies of lie detection experiments. And there's an interesting twist here. Of these 16 studies, none of them agreed with each other. But all of them had a delimited and narrow number, a small number, of regions of the brain that they associated with prevarication, deception. And yet when you put them all together on a single chart, you see that they too are distributed almost every place except the occipital lobe. More evidence for distribution. Here's by far the most heroic study, meta-study that I know about is Kabiza and Nyberg's 2000 paper. And they did a really heroic act. There were 200 and some studies studying every kind of cognitive process you could imagine. And what I want you to do here is get the idea. These are different experiments. This one is working, this particular chart is working memory, verbal, numeric, object, spatial. And across here we have the different regions of the brain, the frontal, the cingulate, the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, and subcortical. I think they primarily meant the cerebellum there. Okay, there seems to be a semblance of localization here because this region is fairly empty. It is fairly empty, however, not because of the results of the experiment, but because there was a problem with the, here's the second part of their chart, there's more. There was a problem at this time in imaging the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe could not be easily imaged, so it appears as a blank there and appears as if there was no activity. We now know that there is activity in the temporal lobe. Here's the same chart for attention. Gives you the same idea. Across the whole brain, vast distribution, and also very, very poor replicability from one experiment to another. Everybody gets something a little bit different. The same thing for imagery, and Kabiza and Nyberg did the same thing for episodic and semantic memory retrieval, for priming, for procedural memory. It wasn't quite as strong for perception, but that's not surprising. Perception involves the primary receiving areas, and that was heavily loaded with the occipital area. And all of these exhibit the same problem of distributed and variable activations from experiment to experiment. Okay, now I pose a conundrum to you. Should the great variability and broad distribution be observed with brain images be attributed to one of two different things? One of them is the lack of a good control of stimulus variables and other random factors, which means we should just keep on in the laboratory and continue to refine our methods to get a better and better solution to this problem. Or is it a true neurobiological state of the brain? Is this data really telling us the truth that any cognitive process is going to activate any part of the brain, and that slight differences in the experimental protocols are going to produce vast differences in, when you compare different experiments? Well, I would like to assume that B is the correct answer here. Fits with my prejudices and my biases. And if that is the case, then we have to start thinking about what the metaphorical stage is. If you remember, the last thing I wanted to do was to present to you a idea about how we should think about the brain now, not in terms of regions that are specialized or cognitive modules that are localized, but rather quite differently. Here's a bit of history. There was a time when getting hit in the head was a sign that it was your brain in the hole that caused problems. In Galen's time and straight through to Leonardo da Vinci, the parts of the brain that were supposed to be associated with our thoughts were misunderstood to be the fluids in the ventricles. That's why Leonardo did his famous studies of putting wax into the ventricles and having producing by the lost wax method a model of the spaces. And he thought that was action. But shortly thereafter, Vesalius began to realize it was the solid portions of the brain, and that's come down with us. And then there was a period of time in which, led really by these two really remarkably incorrect people, Gall and Spurzheim, but then followed by all of the classic brain trauma that could possibly be imagined. Fritz and Hitzig and Munk and Broken in the 19th century all began to think about the brain and language centers and movement centers and perceptual centers and so on. There was one aberration. Lashley in 1950 talked about equipotentiality. That's not what I'm talking about. This is not a brain that I'm going to give you in a minute that is equipotential. It does have functional and anatomical distinctions, but they're not of the kind that we were thinking about. The most recent, I think, is the one that Mike Posner put together and called, buying into the distributed part of the system, but Mike suggested very strongly that these nodes that were distributed around the brain that became part of a system were not they were very, very strict and stable in their localization. It's just that a lot of these tightly controlled nodes were at work when you did that. Now, that we have evidence for a different metaphor. This evidence isn't complete, it's suggestive, but I hope it'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. First of all, everybody agrees that cognitive processes are widely distributed around the brain. By the way, whenever I say everybody, I'm sure I'm wrong, because it's most people or lots of people feel that distribution is the most typical aspect of brain organization. Second, the brain has this remarkable ability to recover, not always immediately, but even but within a relatively short period of time from trauma in one place or another. What I've hoped I've convinced you is about the variability of the responses from all of these different researchers, and essentially the non-replicability, the icon, the central core of science is public replicability, and we're simply not getting that, possibly because we haven't learned how to do it correctly yet, possibly because this is really the state of the brain. The meta-analysis, I think also convincingly to me, showed that there is a distribution and that things are variable, they're popping up all over the place. the fact that brain regions are polyfunctional, the classic paper by Cullum and Can-Wisher made this point. They found a particular area of the brain, and almost everything was activated that part of the brain. It was polyfunctional. And we certainly have a large number of other experiments that are in the sensory domain now that show that the primary receiving areas of the brain are also polymodal, because of the hearing area and the visual areas now are known to interact and to both respond to both kinds of stimulus. And individual differences, it's hard to find to understand what these individuals are based on, but it is possible that what they really represent is a variation, a lack of replicability from person to person. So the new metaphor for the brain that I'd like to present to you to think about is that we have multiple overlapping distributed systems, and that we have multifunctional and idiosyncratic nodes, and by that I mean regions of the brain, can be called up as needed, and that everybody doesn't have the same neural network subserving their cognitive processes at every moment. So the assignment of functions to particular parts of the brain I want to consider it to be transitory and dynamic, in that it may change from moment to moment or from month to month, and certainly from person to person. And it tends to pick out a part of the brain, this microcircuitry that we need, and that microcircuitry may be here in one instance of essentially the same task, or here in another instance. And the brain operates without localization, but it operates as a library of available components at any particular time. And finally, that there's such a heavy interconnections that all of the brains, the diffusion tensor work, which shows these magnificent interconnecting tracks, that these beautiful pictures also make a point that almost everything in the brain is connected to almost everything else, and the conclusion that you would draw from that is that it would be hard to think of a localized region not activating regions elsewhere in the brain. And what I'm suggesting is a much fuzzier kind of brain organization than the current ones, which is still very close to the phrenological modular cognitive process and localized brain region. So how could this happen? Well, here's where I get into deep water, literally. What I'm proposing is a kind of three-dimensional nonlinear system, one in which waves of activity, of neural activity, add and subtract to produce unpredictable activation peaks. This is, as I can find, there is no mathematical model that deals with this. The closest I've come to it is some work that was done on rogue waves, these giant unpredictable waves that had for years popped up instantaneously. On the television this morning, I noticed a Japanese freighter had been capsized by what was reported to be a rogue wave, a sudden, very large wave appearing on an otherwise small wave type of environment. And where these peaks occur is determined by many, many factors. And this accounts for their great variability, uncertainty, and unpredictability. Now that's just an analog. That's another metaphor. But I'm proposing here that there is not, this is not a completely off-the-shelf idea. By the way, the nonlinear models that Osborne and his colleagues used to describe rogue waves are unsolvable. They've never been able to do that. All they've been able to show is that the general idea of a near random collection of small waves can unpredictably, for complex reasons which are beyond our ken, suddenly produce a great big wave. And that's the analogy that I'd like to make with those waves. Now, what are the implications of this? Well, of everything I've said, the basic populace of these neural nets, the microscopically encoded neural nets, cannot be adequately studied by macroscopic. We're working at the wrong level of analysis, but that micro neural net activity is the proper level. So all of our studies of macro measures, EEGs and MRIs, just don't work. And the reason they don't work is because there's a real biological message being sent to us, and that is distribution. Spontaneous, irregular, unpredictable waves popping up from time to time. This assumes, of course, that the variability is biologically real and not driven just by inadequate methodology. I'm sure that this will not go over well with everybody, but brain imaging has been useful in breaking down old ideas, but it cannot in principle, solve the basic mind-brain problem as I presented it to you at the beginning. In fact, what we have here is the ultimate neuroscience catch-22. Brain imaging has shown us that we cannot do that which it is best at doing, answering the localization of cognitive functions. It's a bad question. A lot of energy is going into something that will not answer the fundamental scientific question. And now, I don't know how many of you have seen this, and I throw this in just for a little fun at the end. How many of you know what this is? That side of the room, not this side of the room. This is a picture taken from a study by Bennett, Baird, Miller, and Walford. And this is a paper, by the way, speaking of the zeitgeist and how difficult it is to publish the unpopular. They've been unable to get it published. This picture was part of a poster presentation at a meeting. It's a picture of a salmon that was presented a series of photographs, and a MRI was taken, and it showed a hot spot in the brain of the salmon. Pretty convincing evidence for localization. One tiny little problem. It was a dead salmon. It had no possibility of that being other than an artifact. And I'm told they also did this with a pumpkin and found similar results. Okay, that's always a good laugh.
Right.
I think a minute or two left, and I'm done. So, go ahead.
So I think you seriously misrepresented that. Sorry, let's clap first.
Yeah, let's clap.
So there are so many problems in your talk, I don't know where to start, but I'll start with the last thing, because I think that you seriously misrepresented. The point of that paper was to show that if you do it right, you don't find the thing in the salmon's brain. That's the example of doing it wrong. And you can show that and tell the world that, oh, look, imagers don't know what they're doing because they find a blob using their methods. That's using bad methods.
These seem to be parallel to me. Of course their method was bad, and of course it didn't work. But and as I said, I presented it more as a humorous exclamation mark to my talk.
Sure, but I think you presented it in a way that for people who don't know about these things, it would have suggested that, oh, that's the same kind of method that is the state of the art in imaging. And the point of their paper was if you use the state of the art methods to correct multiple comparisons, you don't find any spots in the data standard. You only find it if you use this method that, yes, some people who are ignorant of state of the art methods still use. And I agree that's a problem. And I actually have tried to help them get this paper published. I think
good.
it hasn't been published for other reasons, which had to do more with the paper than with the zeitgeist.
Okay.
But I think that you really misrepresented that.
I apologize to them, to the audience.
Well,
to
Nicole's
all of
getting
you.
ready. We'll take a couple more questions, but we want to have the full discussion at the end.
I just want to say, as the author of a recent, or co-author of a recent analysis, I couldn't disagree more about the idea that there's no consistency across the studies that appropriately use appropriate experimental designs to isolate a targeted cognitive process. So in my particular case, which was concerned with episodic memory, it was astonishing how regular the results were across something like 40 or 50 studies. Another point I'd just like to make, I think if Mauricio Corbetta here, he'd be quite upset by your presenting his model, the Corbetta and Shulman model, as an example of a distributed cognitive process. That model supposes that attention is an emergent property of functionally specialized nodes which are rigidly localized within the brain. So, for example, within the temporoparietal junction, they propose that there are neural circuits that do what is called bottom-up attention capture. In the intraparietal sulcus, there are neural circuits that are responsible for top-down attention. In the dorsal frontal cortex, there are circuits that are important to integrate with these parietal circuits to give rise to attentional control. It's true that attention at a high level is an emergent property of the circuit properties of these systems, but in no way are they supposing that these elemental cognitive operations, such as circuit breaking, are not rigidly localized within the brain. They certainly would disagree most strongly with the idea that when you do this experiment over and over again, attentional circuit breaking is going to move from the temporoparietal junction to somewhere else, to somewhere else, to somewhere else.
I'm
So
sure
I
they.
think
I'm
that's
sure
a
they would.
mischaracterization, actually, of what they mean by a distributed system.
I accept your comments. It still seems to me that they have committed, is that too strong a word? They have ignored the fact that there are multiple regions of the brain involved in any cognitive processing. And no matter how finely you divide them, you simply can't get down to a point at which you're talking about localization to a small region of the brain. That's a difference of opinion.
I think you see now that indeed, stay around for the discussion. It's going to be lively. Bill, if you could